To say that Donald Trump has many plans for his second term would be an understatement. He has vowed to carry out the largest deportation operation in American history, secure the US-Mexico border, and negotiate a peace agreement between Ukraine and Russia. For Trump, however, all these items may be trivial compared to another problem. That problem is solving the North Korean nuclear conundrum. Deactivating Pyongyang's nuclear program is Trump's proverbial white whale, a feat that none of his predecessors have achieved. Members of Trump's inner circle said in late November that the next president had talked about resuming the personal diplomacy with North Korean leader Kim Jong Un that began during his first term. Solving the North Korean nuclear issue was difficult 5 years ago, but it will be even more difficult today. During his first term, Trump managed to build a personal relationship with the North Korean head of state, despite resistance among his national security advisors.
Little Rocket Man, we're going to do it because we really have no choice. When I say to the North, do not underestimate us and do not try us. Rocket Man should have been handled a long time ago. Rocket Man is on a suicide mission for himself. The weapons you are acquiring are not making you safer.
This was the right move at the time. After all, the Bush and Obama administrations' bottom-up attempts to negotiate with Pyongyang were both laborious and unsuccessful. After nearly a year of fire-breathing rhetoric and talk of a bloody nose attack to scare Pyongyang into talks, Trump has chosen to gamble on direct diplomacy. This was partly because his other options ranged from ineffective to disastrous, and partly because then South Korean President Moon Jae-in was able to convince Trump that a direct channel of communication to Kim could be the key to securing a historic nuclear deal. Despite 3 Trump-Kim meetings, face-to-face diplomacy has produced nothing in the long run. Although Trump managed to get North Korea to suspend missile tests for a year, the showy summit ultimately crashed and burned. In the end, Trump and Kim, whatever their personal chemistry, could not agree. Trump advocated the complete denuclearization of North Korea. Kim was only willing to demobilize the main plutonium research facility at Yongbyon. US-North Korean diplomacy has been dead ever since. So what will Mr. Trump's relationship with Kim Jong Un be like in his second term? Kim Jong Un has not forgotten his previous meetings with Mr. Trump. He sees the summits in 2018 and 2019 as a waste of time at best and a personal humiliation at worst. This should not be surprising. The North Korean leader has invested considerable capital in negotiating a deal to lift US sanctions and normalize Pyongyang-US relations. On both issues, his pleas have failed. After 3 summits, the US sanctions remained intact, and US-North Korean relations remained as tough as ever. Now, Kim Jong Un is renewing his pledge to expand the country's atomic arsenal. The state-run Korean Central News Agency released photos of Kim leading an undated inspection of the North Korean Nuclear Weapons Institute and Nuclear Material Production Base. During his visit, Kim said 2025 would be a turning point for strengthening their nuclear forces in line with the 5-year military development plan adopted in 2021. All other priorities should be subordinated to boosting national prestige and relevance, Kim said, calling for breakthrough achievements in producing weapons-grade nuclear material and strengthening the country's nuclear shield. New footage shows Kim and accompanying officials walking between rows of centrifuges in a hall. Analysis suggests the site matches photographs of a newly constructed addition to the nuclear enrichment facility at Yongbyon, about 60 miles north of the capital. The complete denuclearization of North Korea remains a priority for President Donald Trump. Trump has said he will reach out to Kim again and hold talks on the nuclear issue. Kim will be more cautious this time. Previously, the North Korean leader has said that they have explored every possible avenue in negotiations with the United States, and the result has been more US aggression. The geopolitical environment has also evolved. In 2018-2019, North Korea was isolated, and the suspension of US sanctions was seen as critical for its economic growth. But now, Putin's war in Ukraine has provided the Kim regime with a golden opportunity to diversify its foreign relations away from China by getting closer to Moscow, especially by sending thousands of North Korean troops to the Ukrainian-Russian front. Formerly a partner in the United States' desire to denuclearize North Korea, Russia is now using North Korea as a way to thwart America's grand ambitions in East Asia. For Kim, the advantages of his relationship with Russia are equally clear. Putin needs weapons and men. Kim needs money and military technology. And thanks to Russia's veto in the UN Security Council, additional sanctions are a dream for the foreseeable future, while those already in place are meekly implemented. As long as the Russia-North Korea relationship continues at its current pace, it will be difficult for Trump to bring the North Koreans back to the negotiating table. None of this is to suggest that Trump should not pursue another diplomatic initiative with North Korea. Despite the criticism he received at the time, Trump's decision to mix things up and go straight to the source was an admirable attempt to manage a problem that has challenged US presidents for more than 3 decades. But if Trump wants a second roll of the dice, he needs to keep in mind a healthy dose of skepticism. Given the continuous improvement of North Korea's nuclear and ballistic missile capabilities, any deal the United States signs with the Kim regime will be less impressive than it could have been in 2019. On the other hand, the United States must nurture old alliances to contain North Korea. Donald Trump criticizes US commitments on the Korean Peninsula, but he needs to reassure South Korea and Japan. Former President Joe Biden's administration neither prioritized nor successfully addressed the North Korean nuclear threat. Yet, it reassured South Korea and Japan of US security commitments. In contrast, Trump has repeatedly expressed his disdain for the US-South Korea alliance, citing the cost. This has rightly raised concerns in Seoul about the stability of bilateral relations. Questions have been raised about the permanence of recent agreements, such as the Washington Declaration of April 2023. As a result, the Nuclear Consultative Group was established, which aims to strengthen US-South Korea extended deterrence, joint military exercises, and contingency planning. Seoul would also be concerned about Trump's renegotiation of the recently signed Special Measures. The Special Measures is the agreement under which South Korea agreed to increase its financial share to $1.19 billion in 2026 for the continued presence of US troops. These concerns about US withdrawal come at a time when inter-Korean relations are at their lowest ebb. In October, North Korea accused South Korea of flying military drones over its airspace to drop anti-DPRK leaflets. Shortly afterward, Pyongyang ordered border troops to be ready to fire, and South Korea indicated that it was ready to respond. Such developments have further fueled the debate in South Korea about the possibility of an independent nuclear development rhetoric must be separated from reality when analysing the trajectory of future US policy towards North Korea. Trump's recent cabinet appointments point to a possible hawkish approach towards China, but they also show that his administration is willing to differentiate its foreign policy from that of his predecessor. Could Trump's unpredictability damage his foreign policy? Since first running for president in 2016, Trump has positioned himself as an unpredictable leader, arguing that doing so would strengthen US foreign policy. Trump's first term was indeed an exercise in unpredictability. He threatened North Korean leader Kim Jong Un with fire and fury like the world has never seen before. But then he became the first American president to meet with a North Korean leader and declared that the two had fallen in love. Trump is not the first leader to openly embrace a disorderly foreign policy. For decades, heads of state around the world have been using what is known as the madman theory. The idea that by acting in a highly erratic manner, they can intimidate their opponents into compliance. During the Cold War, for example, some strategists argued that by appearing unstable, a US leader could encourage communist states to take US nuclear threats more seriously. But Trump should be careful when it comes to the unpredictable man theory, because scientific studies show that it is very difficult to use successfully. In fact, it is rare that a reputation for unpredictability actually works internationally. Modern leaders and heads of state who try to appear unpredictable often fail to convince their opponents. Others succeed, only to find that their reputation for unpredictability convinces their opponents that they cannot be trusted to keep the peace. Trump will therefore have to walk a fine line, convincing other states that he is unpredictable enough to carry out his threats, but stable enough to stand by the deals he has made. History shows that this will not be easy. The theory of the unpredictable man dates back at least to 1517. At that time, the political philosopher Niccolo Machiavelli argued that under certain circumstances, it is a very wise thing to simulate madness. But the modern concept was developed in the mid-20th century, when the advent of nuclear weapons posed a new challenge to threat credibility. Because nuclear war would result in mutually certain destruction for both sides, and conventional conflict could easily escalate to the nuclear level, the US and Soviet governments had strong deterrents to fighting each other. This meant that threats from one to the other could easily be ignored. After all, why would the leaders of both countries do something potentially suicidal in response to non-existent threats? The answer: by going mad. A rational US president or Soviet prime minister would try to avoid a nuclear conflict at all costs. But, as RAND defense strategist Daniel Ellsberg told a conference in 1959, a convincingly insane person could credibly threaten great risks. Other experts agreed. The ideas of these strategists soon gained a significant following. US President Richard Nixon, for example, was a strong supporter. In fact, according to the memoirs of former White House Chief of Staff H.R. Haldeman, it was Nixon who gave the concept its name. "I call it the madman theory, Bob," the incoming president said in 1968 when discussing ways to force North Vietnam to surrender. Other international leaders also tried to put the theory into practice. In the 1950s and 1960s, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev deliberately cultivated an image of madness that at least initially some US officials believed. More recently, Russian President Vladimir Putin gained a reputation of madness after invading Ukraine. Former British Prime Minister Boris Johnson has said that Putin can be an irrational actor and think irrationally about the effects of sanctions and the risks of war. Putin's repeated threats to use nuclear weapons only bolstered this idea. The mad theory may be popular, but historically it has not done much for its adherents. Nixon failed to convince the North Vietnamese and their Soviet allies of his madness, and was eventually forced to withdraw from Vietnam. During the Soviet Union's efforts to seize all of Berlin, Khrushchev threatened to use nuclear weapons and seemed unable to control his emotions when meeting with Western officials. Yet he was unable to force the United States to withdraw. The most obvious reason for this bad history is that it is difficult for any leader, especially leaders of nuclear-armed countries, to convince their opponents that their behavior is fundamentally irrational. But many leaders manage to develop a reputation for instability or extreme unpredictability and still fail. This is because, by engaging in such behavior, leaders have difficulty convincing their opponents that they will make any commitments. Convincing the leaders of foreign governments to submit to a demand does not, after all, require convincing them that resistance will be punished. It also requires convincing them that submission would actually avoid punishment. Consider, for example, Putin's threats to retaliate against the West for supporting Ukraine. In addition to references to Russia's nuclear arsenal, they also include threats of direct attacks on NATO countries. In November, for example, Putin said he could attack the military facilities of countries that allow their weapons to be used against our facilities. But despite such harsh threats, Putin has failed to change Western policy. One reason may be that Western analysts doubt Putin's readiness to attack a nuclear-armed enemy. But equally important, they may doubt that compliance with Putin's demands will lead to peace. Russian hawks in the West have repeatedly argued that if Putin is victorious in Ukraine, he will not stop there. He will continue to attack other countries, including NATO members. They say it is better for the West to resist Putin now than later. This paradox is difficult for leaders who describe themselves as crazy to resolve. Leaders with a reputation for unpredictability often find it difficult to give credible guarantees. Likewise, leaders with reputations based on abnormal or distorted preferences such as those associated with fanaticism or extremism, also struggle. But not all leaders are perceived as equally unpredictable. US officials saw Khrushchev as a hothead who could get out of control in a conflict, but no one thought he would randomly attack the United States. These leaders are likely to perform better on the international stage because they can combine a credible threat of war with a credible promise of peace. For example, Khrushchev's unpredictable behavior during the Cuban Missile Crisis convinced US President John F. Kennedy to withdraw US nuclear missiles from Turkey. Kim Jong Un managed to turn his unpredictability into a meeting with Trump that enhanced Kim's prestige. Trump's foray into the theory of unpredictability can be productive in some cases. For example, his reputation for unpredictability could act as a deterrent against the US's most powerful rivals, China and Russia. Beijing is rapidly expanding its nuclear forces, and Moscow is almost constantly rattle nuclear sabers. Both states can hope that this behavior will deter the US from intervening if China attacks Taiwan or Russia attacks a NATO country. Otherwise, Washington could find itself in a nuclear conflict. But if Trump convinces both countries that he would be ready to do anything in response to their provocations, he could upset such calculations and stop the invasions. But Trump's approach could also fail spectacularly. If Beijing believes that Trump will arbitrarily impose sanctions or other punishments on China, it will be more likely to challenge the US, even if it respects US interests. More worryingly, in an extreme scenario, if the US finds itself on the edge of a nuclear cliff with Beijing or Moscow, Trump's reputation for unpredictability could heighten fears of a US-first nuclear strike. It could thus potentially lead both governments to launch a preemptive nuclear strike. And even if Trump's mad approach makes some progress with China and Russia, it could undermine his relations with weaker rivals. Iran and North Korea, for example, will cling more tightly to their nuclear programs if they believe that Trump might act to topple their regimes. No matter how credible Trump's threats are, both countries are unlikely to succumb to US threats without a corresponding credible promise of long-term peace and security. For all these reasons, Trump will have to show that there are limits to unpredictability. He will have to make it clear that his foreign policy is not completely irrational and that he can be trusted to support a deal. Such an approach will not only increase the likelihood of Washington complying with his threats, it would also reduce the risk of accidental escalation and thus reassure allies nervous about Trump's policies. Unfortunately, it is very difficult to convey exactly the right level of unpredictability. Leaders like Khrushchev and Nixon may not have gone far enough because they were skeptical of their opponent's willingness to use nuclear weapons. Trump can succeed if he can portray himself as unpredictable and unbridled without appearing unstable. Thank you for following us.